Okay, there could be some really good opportunities here in cocoa. First off, read this disclaimer carefully. We will actually look at a natural resource in this video, and it is in the softs. Specifically, it's cocoa. Here you can see the distance from the 52-week low and 52-week highs. Okay, we will look at both the cocoa futures and the ETN called IPATH, NIB, Dow Jones, UBS, Cocoa, ETN. The reason why cocoa, well, we will get to it. First, let's look at the seasonality. We are currently in July, which is one of the weaker months for cocoa. Well, this period here is weaker. However, it does improve heading into autumn, which is interesting from a more tactical standpoint. But it gets even more interesting when we look here at the actual numbers. Okay, so this is the longer term picture, weekly data points, and you can see we go all the way back here to 2005. You can see that the bears have been aggressive, and we have pushed back all the way to these support levels, and these support levels way back here in 2011, 2012. That also means that as far as a speculative bullish opportunity, you want to buy low and sell high, this is a rather low level. It represents a highly speculative but interesting opportunity, because many, markets are a bit elevated now, hence, it can be difficult to get a bargain. Hence, this recent bearishness could actually be contrarianly bullish. So this is the history of the cocoa price. You could certainly make the case that we have lower highs and lower lows. There are some major rising and declining cycle patterns. Let's see if we can get something a bit more clear here. Maybe like this. Okay, so I have added some cycle patterns here, cycle analysis, and you can see that there are some major rise and declining cycles. 1, 2, 3. Seems to be some level of consistency with these cycles. That's interesting. You also see that there are some smaller cycles within. So based on this cycle analysis, you could make the case that there could be more downward pressure. The key thing about the cycle, okay, is that even though based on the cycles here, there seems to be downward pressure, that doesn't necessarily mean that the price will necessarily go lower. It simply means that there is a pressure to the downside. As an example, here we have a declining cycle, but we did actually make a new high here, but you see that the sell-off was very sharp. Hence there was like a bias towards downside, a pressure. But cycle analysis, it is a mix of an art and a science. And you can see that longer term cycles have also changed. But it is an interesting field. Okay, so we're looking at the RSI. It is, approaching oversold territory, and historically it doesn't like to be oversold, so that could be, triggering some buying. There's a 59% correlation with S&P 500, so there's a positive correlation, but not like super strong. Let's just get the correlation on the daily data points. Yeah, 69%. Now let's look at the correlation with between the cocoa and the NIB. So the US cocoa futures, we put it there, and then we took the NIB, which is the ETN. Here we have a 97% positive correlation. That is really good. That is what we want to see. Ideally we want to see 99, but 97 is good on the weekly data points. On the daily data points we have 98%, so that is, all in all, there is a very, very strong correlation between the futures and the ETN. Let's get the SPY back here. let's analyze the cocoa futures with daily data points. So here you can see that we recently tested quite aggressively the red 200-day moving average. Test, 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 and test, and after the fourth failure, that's when you had this very sharp sell-off, a lot of losses very, very fast. It is very interesting though that we have slipped back into a territory where buyers have stepped in before. And you can see that there are these rise declining cycles. Based on the size of the previous cycles, you could make the case that this currently declining cycle, there's not necessarily that much selling left. Because even if we look further back, the cocoa futures, they really move in these waves, up and down, up and down. If you look at the RSI, you can see that we are approaching oversold territory, and on the daily data points, we don't like to be it. It usually is a level where buyers step in. To be perfectly clear, buying the cocoa here, like, you know, because the futures market is quite complicated, there's all kinds of leverage and risk, which we will get into. So the NIB with the ETN, that could be a very good alternative. You can see that the chart looks very similar. Okay, buying here after a sell-off to a previous support level, it is of course speculative. It is a very aggressive, you know, buy the plunge strategy. But from a speculative standpoint, it is interesting. I mean, you can clearly see yourself, there is this very clear cyclical pattern. When we did look at the weeklies, we did see that on the major big picture cycles, you could make the case that there could be more downside pressure. But that is of course based on cycles that have worked recently. If you go further back in the cycles, you see that when there's a change in the market, then there will be sort of like a break in the cycle and new cycles will begin. And something that is very relevant for cycle analysis is of course the seasonality of the actual product. And if you look here at the NIB, no, I mean they are correlated, you can see here that this month it is weak, but it also means that it could be a very good opportunity to find a low, because August and September are quite good. Let's compare it against the S&P 500, the SPY. So now we are looking at the relative strength. So this is the percentage of months in which cocoa outperformed the S&P 500 between 2009 and 2020. Here again, July is one of the worst months. But then again, here comes August. 60% of the time, cocoa is outperforming the S&P 500. Those are relatively decent odds, especially when you take into account that the S&P is at a very elevated level. Especially when you take into account the health of the economy. Okay, so let's talk a bit about cocoa. So, introduction. Futures contract is CC. And we have you know, the NIB, the ETN. But when it comes to the futures contract, one contract, it equals a whopping 10 metric tons of cocoa. The minimum tick size is $10. Cocoa was discovered over 3,000 years ago in Central America. It was used by the Maya Indians, as an example. The top producers are Ivory Coast and Ghana. These two represent around 70% of the market. Then you have Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia, Ecuador, and Cameroon. The classic use cases is certainly chocolate, whole cocoa, and it is also used, you know, as a spice in many different kinds of food. There are actually health benefits to cocoa. That's one of those things that is not that widely known. You could make a case, and I would make the case, that chocolate, it gets a bad rap because of all the, you know, unhealthy kinds of candy. Chocolate is actually one of the more healthy types of candy. I mean, the really bad candy, that's like jelly beans, hard candy. I mean, basically it's just sugar. Because chocolate, it is based on this bean, you know, the cocoa bean, and it has health benefits. It is very rich in antioxidants, There's these polyphenols that improve blood flow, flavonols, they elevate mood. The thing is that, the higher the cocoa content is, the better. Hence, ideally you should look for, dark chocolate. Hence, if you want something sweet, chocolate is very superior to like a donut or a cake. Chocolate is, you could make a case for chocolate. Though, of course, everything in moderation. Yeah, to sum up my take on cocoa, there are quite clearly these major general cycle patterns. It could very well be that we are looking at the end or later part, at least, of this declining cycle, which means that there could be some good buying opportunities. You see previously, like this move here, that's 60%. That's pretty good. This move here, up here, all of a sudden 66%. Hence, there can be some pretty sizable moves when there is a move in cocoa, and this is at a low level. And the reason why these kinds of commodities are very interesting is because other markets are quite elevated. Let's look at the S&P 500 futures. Yes, we are today seeing the bulls step up again. We have had 4 days in a row now of buying after we found support at 50-day moving average. Today we are crossing above the 20-day moving average, and this is quite clearly constructive for the bulls. But as long as we are below this massive super bearish candlestick, we are still basically shell-shocked. We need to clear this level until it makes sense to be really like, okay, the bulls are back in charge. Because currently this isn't more, it's more, a battle. Hand wrestling. Looking at the longer term picture for the S&P 500, clearly there's been a trend change. Here is a more or less basic bull market, and then you see that there's increased level of volatility. Here it decreases a bit, and here it really starts to increase, and here it goes ballistic. Hence, from these levels to here, to here, to here, you see that the market is becoming increasingly dangerous. And that means that there is unique risk with being here in the S&P 500, which is why diversification is a pretty good idea. Okay, let's look at some other data here. The expense ratio is 0.75% for the ETN. Given that there's very limited competition in this space, this is not a huge surprise. There's of course no dividend. If you look at the holdings here, yeah, it's we don't get any details, unfortunately. Let's look at fund flows. The last let's look at the last 6 months. This is interesting. This is rather interesting. So here you can see that the bears are quite clearly. There's a lot of selling, but the buyers are stepping in. So is this the smart money being like, well, this is a good deal on cocoa? Could be. This is interesting. Okay, whatever you do, of course, don't fight the trend, and may the trend be with you.